Hi guys, thank you for coming for another one of my videos. This is video number 3 in a row, so I hope you're happy. This is a video about the Middle East geopolitics explained. Hopefully, at least it says simply. So I'm on a kick recently. At least the whole world is to trying to understand the Middle East, trying to understand what's going on, and I want to get a better picture of. I know a lot about. Well, I know a good amount about it, about the Sykes-Picot Agreement and after the Second World War or the First World War, with the division of Iraq and Syria, then the British and French protectorate. It's a very interesting history. I know the surface about it, but yeah. So I want to learn more because of what's been going on in the world with Afghanistan and so yeah, I hope you like this video, and let's watch this.
The Middle East geopolitics explained simply. What is the Middle East? The Middle East is a loosely defined region at the crossroads of Asia, Europe, and Africa,
I don't think
normally included in the list of
I don't think Afghanistan is included in the Middle
Middle
East.
Eastern countries are the countries of the Arabian Peninsula, that is, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, as well as Egypt, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, and Iran. The term Middle East can be used to refer to countries that are predominantly Islamic in culture. This usage expands the term to include the remaining states of North Africa, as well as Afghanistan and even perhaps Pakistan. Why is the Middle East always in the news? The Middle East is always in the news because the region is embroiled in many conflicts for reasons which we will go on to explore. The conflicts are covered extensively in world news as the Middle East is globally important.
Nobody talks
Several
about Yemen
countries in the
though.
region are rich in oil and natural resources,
Nobody.
which it exports to the rest of the world at competitive prices. Who lives in the Middle East? The Middle East is home to
Let me
several
guess.
ethnic minorities,
Humans.
including Arabs, Turks, Persians,
I'm sorry.
Kurds, and Jews. The three major Abrahamic religions were born in the Middle East: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Islam is the major religion in the region. The two major branches of Islam are Sunni Islam and Shia Islam.
Yeah.
What are the reasons for the conflicts in the Middle East? The main causes behind the conflicts in the Middle East can be boiled down to the following. 1. The way the Middle East was divided by foreign powers
Yeah.
after the World Wars. 2. The spread of Wahhabism across the region. 3. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Okay.
4. The regional rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And 5. American foreign policy. We'll look at each point in more detail. Division of the Middle East by foreign powers. During World
Foreign
War
powers.
I, the
Ah,
British and the French convinced the Arabs to revolt against the Ottoman Empire in exchange
which
for
is such a stab in the back. You know, they go to the Arabs in the Middle East who are under the Ottomans, and they're saying to them, listen, if you revolt with us, or if you revolt against the empire, we will give you independence after the war. And they totally backstabbed them at the end as well.
independent Arab
1917,
states after
18.
the projected fall of the Ottoman Empire. However, after the Allies won World War I, the Middle East was divided up between Britain and France according to their own interests, rather than what would be good for the diverse range of people and ethnic groups that lived in the region. After World War II, Britain and France could no longer afford to continue their imperialist strategies and left the region, but the borders they had established remained. This meant that people with deeply held but differing beliefs and ideologies ended up living side by side in the same country. Ethnic groups such as the Kurds ended up with no homeland at all. The spread of Wahhabism. A powerful dynasty, the House of Saud, had been fighting for control of much of the Arabian Peninsula from the 16th century onwards. By 1932, they were successful in creating a unified Saudi Arabia, with the House of Saud, the ruling royal family of Saudi Arabia, controlling the country as an absolute monarchy. The rulers of Saudi Arabia follow a fundamentalist doctrine of Islam known as Wahhabism. When vast amounts of oil was discovered in Saudi Arabia, the country became
They're so lucky because if it wasn't for that oil, it'd be so dead.
unimaginably wealthy overnight, which allowed the export of Wahhabism throughout the Middle East, promoting an ardent religious fervor over a more moderate religious culture. The
Hmm.
Israel Palestine conflict.
The
Both
ye old. conflict of the century.
Jews and Palestinians lay claim to a land in a small part of the Middle East. The claims arise from historical and religious connections. After the First World War and the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the British came to control the region in question. It was known as the British Mandate for Palestine. Throughout the 20th century, both Jewish nationalism and Arab nationalism gained traction. Zionism was and is a movement that promoted the establishment of a Jewish state in their ancestral homeland, what was the British Palestine Mandate. The movement inspired mass immigration of Jews into British Palestine, which caused tensions with the existing Palestinians already living there. After the Second World War, the world had immense sympathy with the Jewish people, having borne witness to the Holocaust and Hitler's actions. The British, who had promised to help establish a Jewish state, were unable to come up with a satisfactory plan for both Jews and Palestinians, and looked to the United Nations. In 1947, the UN proposed a plan which would allow both the Jews and Palestinians to have two separate states, but as soon as the British left the region and Israel declared independence, war broke out between Israel and the surrounding hostile Arab nations.
Of course.
Israel not only won the war, but managed to gain territory
By the way, how the fuck did they win the war, man? Look at this. If you're playing Victoria 2, you're fucked in this situation. But in real life, you win what?
in what was meant to be part of the Palestinian state. Over time, Israel has emerged as a power to be reckoned with, and Arab nations have begrudgingly accepted Israel's existence. As a consequence, the wider Arab-Israeli conflict has reduced down to a more localized Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Over the course of multiple wars, Palestinian refugees have been displaced from their homes, and the Palestinians who do remain within what was meant to be Palestine are now effectively under Israeli control. With international facilitation, Israeli and Palestinian leaders have made attempts to find a resolution. However,
Yeah,
each
we
time
all
the
know
peace
how that
process
worked
has been
out.
derailed by extremist players on both sides. Israel continues to face open hostility in the Middle East from nations such as Iran and Syria, as well as militant political groups such as Hamas, based in the Gaza Strip, and Hezbollah, based in Lebanon. Israel is no longer making any real attempt to give Palestinians their land back, and Palestinians are losing hope. The existence of Israel and how it came
I wonder what's gonna happen with the Palestinians after, the next 10 years, for example, because surprisingly, public opinion has shifted towards the Palestinians, which is a huge shift, and an unprecedented shift, at least in my opinion. Whenever you see politicians speak or people speak, it was always on the behalf of the Jewish people. Nowadays, so I don't know what's gonna happen. Are they gonna get, or are they gonna just get evicted? Is there gonna be another crisis in Europe in terms of immigration
to
or
be
a refugee fleeing Palestine because Israel says enough is enough and they just take over.
remains a source of resentment for many in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia and Iran rivalry. Relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran soured after the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Prior to that, both nations were governed by Western-backed monarchies, but Iran's revolution overthrew the Iranian Shah and a new regime with a different ideology took its place.
The guy's
Iran
been in power since '79. That's 42 years. The guy's been in power, dude.
was ruled by a religious theocracy, whereas Saudi Arabia was an absolute monarchy, and Iranian leaders had no qualms in denouncing the Saudi Arabian regime as
So he's
un-Islamic.
he's basically like the Pope in terms of absolute power within his domain. Because the Pope, the Vatican, it's an absolute monarchy,
The
which is
countries began competing for dominance and influence in the Middle East, which resulted in several proxy wars being fought in places such as Yemen and Syria. Proxy wars are wars where competing powers don't fight each other directly but get involved in foreign wars, backing opposing sides. Saudi Arabia has a majority Sunni Muslim population, and Iran has a majority Shia Muslim
of
population.
course,
In the conflicts
of
across the
course.
Middle East, Saudi Arabia generally supports
So let me guess. The Saudis want to spread Sunni Islam throughout the Middle East. The Iranians
Sunni
want
groups,
Shia,
and Iran supports Shia
of
groups.
course.
American foreign policy. After the Second World War, America and the Soviet Union emerged as the two competing world powers. Both had ideological differences. America was and is a capitalist democracy, whereas the Soviet Union espoused communism as the best method for governance. America's presence in the Middle East after the Second World War was there to stem the spread of Soviet backed communism. Americans were initially welcomed in the region, being viewed in a favorable light when compared to the imperialist European powers that had previously had a strong
Boy,
foothold
did
in that
that
part of the
not last
world.
long.
When oil was discovered in the Middle East, it became even more important for America to protect its interests in the region. Modern life is dependent on oil energy. America's consumers, and therefore their economy, demand oil, and as such, it is important to America that the Middle East is stable. However, try as they might, America's peacekeeping and nation building efforts have failed and sometimes exacerbated the situation on the ground. America also has strong ties with Israel, which doesn't make it popular in the Middle East. Israel is a strong and stable democracy and has proved its military might in the region. The American public remember the Holocaust, and there is a prominent pro Israel lobby in America. All these factors contribute to the strong relationship between the two countries and America's backing of Israel. America also has strong ties with Saudi Arabia, an absolute monarchy. Their alliance stems from the economics of oil. This alliance can be viewed as
I wonder what's gonna happen once oil runs out, because it's gonna run out eventually. Will America take a more aggressive stance towards Saudi Arabia, or will Saudi Arabia's wealth protect it from American uh, righteousness? I guess because if they're wealthy enough, if they own enough of America, like China does, China owns, you know, how many apartments in New York have you heard of a Chinese billionaire coming buying 5 apartments for like 300 million, then moving away, never stepping foot in them? The amount of property that the Chinese own on American soil is insane, and so America going against the Chinese like strongly is much more difficult. I wonder if that's what the Saudis are going to do as well.
either American pragmatism or alternatively American hypocrisy. Those who level the hypocrisy accusation argue that America espouses democracy and anti dictator sentiment only when it comes to dealing with regimes and dictators that don't play ball. They
I
argue
mean,
that Saudi Arabia and several of the countries in the Middle East who have ruling monarchies are the very antithesis of democracy, and
it's a
yet
pretty
America
good
continues
argument
to be
when you
their
think about
ally.
it.
On the 11th of September 2001, a terrorist group, Al Qaeda, carried out the Twin Tower terror attacks in New York, killing thousands of civilians. In response, America invaded Afghanistan, where the leader of Al Qaeda,
Not
Osama bin Laden,
anymore.
had been given shelter. The US
We'll see what
government,
happens with
under the Bush
that.
administration, then proposed a preemptive strike against Iraq, linking President Saddam Hussein with supporting terrorism and shoring up weapons of mass destruction. After 9/11, anti Muslim sentiment had reached high levels in the American psyche, and terrorist organizations had successfully managed to muddy the waters between fundamentalist Muslim fighters with a political agenda and moderate Muslim civilians. This meant that it was relatively easy for the American public to initially support the invasion of Iraq. However, as the war in Iraq dragged on and it transpired that much of the evidence for going to war in the first place was not supported by strong intelligence, the appetite for war dwindled, and America ultimately withdrew from Iraq in 2011. The
Eight
aftermath of the war
years
in Iraq
later.
led to fertile ground for fundamentalist terrorist organizations to flourish, namely the Islamic State of Iraq, also known as ISI. That same year, the Arab Spring protests erupted, a series of pro
I remember
democracy,
that.
anti government movements across the Middle East, which led to the outbreak of civil war in Syria. This gave ISI a chance to spread across to Syria, and they became known as the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, otherwise known as ISIS. ISIS declared a worldwide caliphate and claimed religious, political, and military authority over all Muslims across the globe. This was strongly rejected by mainstream Muslim groups, the UN, and international governments. In 2014, the US was once again compelled to intervene directly in the Middle East in light of the growing influence of ISIS. The US faces a conundrum when it comes to the Middle East. They stay in the region to protect their allies and their own national interests, but their presence and military interventions are used by terrorist organizations to radicalize displaced young men, which have resulted in attacks carried out on American soil. To a certain extent, the world has looked to the US to lead, and they
It's a
have,
never
by
ending
toppling
cycle.
regimes and attempting to export democracy in a region with such a different culture, background, and history, has proved unsuccessful. Timeline of major
I mean, what's funny is that, in the last video that we reacted, the one in Afghanistan, where we learned that there was a democracy and then there was a communist regime. It's interesting that, there was, I don't know for how long it lasted, the democratic Afghanistan, uh, but it's very interesting that it worked, in many ways, because, people say you cannot give People in the Middle East, democracy, don't know what it is. They've never had it, which is true. But in Afghanistan, from what we learned from last video, there was democracy for a brief period of time when the king gave up his power and basically then the good guy got killed, but well exiled.
conflicts and events in the Middle East. To understand the current status of the Middle East, it's helpful to rewind back through the major conflicts and events that happened in the region from the middle of the 20th century to the present day. We've already touched on how the Middle East was divided up after the First World War, the American and Soviet Union influence in the region after the Second World War, the establishment of Israel, and the discovery of oil. So let us now look at the 1979 Iranian Revolution. The Iranian oil industry was developed by the British, who enjoyed the monopoly and sale of Iranian oil. By 1952, Iranians had grown tired of the status quo, and their democratically elected prime minister nationalized Iranian oil. In
Oh,
response, the British and Americans organized a military coup to
never
oust the prime
nationalized the
minister.
oil.
The Shah of Iran, who
You
favored
fuck.
modernization and westernization of the country, was unpopular. The rapid modernization was an affront to religious values, and the corruption of his government and brutal political repression by his secret police fueled public resentment.
I mean, look what happened in Venezuela. The guy, what's his name? Maduro. He nationalized the oil. He nationalized the oil. What was it, like a year or 2 years later? There was this new leader that the U.S. support and like other nations in the EU support over their democratically elected leader. Why do you think? You know?
All this culminated in the 1979 Iranian Revolution, when the Shah was ousted and replaced by religious leaders, the Ayatollahs. The Ayatollahs denounced the US, refused to recognize Israel, and argued against Saudi Arabia's absolute monarchy. Unsurprisingly, none of this made Iran popular with the US, Israel, and
It's so
Saudi
funny
Arabia.
arguing against an
Iran-Iraq
absolute
War
monarchy
1980
when.
to 1988.
Whoa!
In 1980, Iraq's President Saddam Hussein saw an
By the way, just saying, this is an amazing video. Go watch this channel, London City Girl. This is an amazing video.
opportunity in the chaos of the Iranian Revolution to annex oil-rich Iranian territory and to
What
quell the chance of a rebellion
the
in his
fuck do
own
you think you
country.
are?
Saudi
Annexing the
Arabia
whole of
backed
Iran?
Iraq against Iran, and the US reluctantly did the same. The war
Really?
lasted for 8 years with no border changes. Soviet-Afghan War, 1979 to 1989.
Whoa.
At the same time, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in order to prop up the Soviet-backed communist government against insurgent groups known collectively as the Mujahideen. Atheist communism is at odds with the Muslim faith, and the Mujahideen waged a holy war to gain control of the country. The Mujahideen were backed extensively by Saudi Arabia, the US, and Pakistan.
Mm.
Muslim militants across the Arab world joined the fight in Afghanistan, and among them was Osama bin Laden, who would go on to become the founder of Al Qaeda, a fundamentalist Islamic terrorist organization. After the Afghan government collapsed, the Taliban, an Afghan faction of the Mujahideen, emerged and took control over roughly 3/4 of Afghanistan. Gulf War, 1990 to 1991. 2 years after the Iraq-Iran War, Iraq invaded.
So there was a war between Iraq and Iran. Iraq got backed by reluctantly by the U.S. and by the U.K. 3 years later, the U.S. is like, you know what? We back you. No, it's our turn to fucking beat the fuck out of you.
invaded Kuwait in what was a blatant attempt at oil grab.
Yeah.
This alarmed both Saudi Arabia and the US, and the former looked to their powerful military allies for support. Iraq was driven back, and the US military stayed on in Saudi Arabia, signaling their willingness to defend Saudi Arabia's and also their own interests in the Middle East. 9/11 and the US invasion of Afghanistan, 2001. In 2001, Al Qaeda managed to carry out a series of terrorist attacks on the US, where passenger airliners were crashed into the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. Bin Laden cited US support of Israel, the presence of US troops in Saudi Arabia, and sanctions against Iraq as reasons for the attacks. Bin Laden was living in Afghanistan, and America demanded the Taliban hand him over and expel Al Qaeda from the country. When the Taliban failed to comply, America invaded Afghanistan. After a decade-long manhunt, bin Laden was found and killed in Pakistan. Although America forcibly removed the Taliban from power and a new democratically elected government was formed, a significant area of the country is still controlled by the Taliban.
Yeah, not
Invasion of
anymore.
Iraq, 2003. In 2003, America accused Iraq of promoting terrorism and possessing and developing weapons of mass destruction. The US then initiated preemptive military action by organizing a coalition to invade Iraq and remove Saddam Hussein from power. The American public, still reeling from the events of 9/11, were convinced by the American government's arguments that this was an extension of the war on terror, although no real links between Saddam Hussein and Al Qaeda were established. It transpired that Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction as described, and the
But they had
reasons for going to
oil.
war in Iraq have since been highly criticized. The country descended into a bloody civil war along sectarian lines, and much like in the Soviet Afghan War, fundamentalist extremists flooded into the country to fight.
You know what's insane to me is how the sort of, how should I put this? In Afghanistan and in Iraq, the United States lost between, to be honest, I don't have the numbers for Iraq, but I know that the US lost between 3 and 4,000 people over 20 years in Afghanistan. And I think the Afghanis lost like hundreds of thousands. Well, I know that the Iraqis lost hundreds of thousands. I'm speculating when it comes to the Afghanis. I don't know how much, but I heard someone mentioned that they lost hundreds of thousands. I'm gonna put it out there. I'm not sure about this number, but imagine if the United States lost hundreds of thousands of troops. I wonder how they are gonna react because they lost 4,000 people over 20 years in a war, which is nothing, and the U.S. is how should I put this? The United States is reacting about their stay in Afghanistan as if they have 3 million people there in terms of an army, in terms of not only 3 million people there, but like as if they've lost 200,000 people in a war. No, they lost 4,000 over 20 years. 20 years, 20 years. I mean,
America became bogged down until eventually the
and
Iraq
by the way, I don't want to minimize the sacrifice that those 4,000 people did for their country. Okay, I don't want to do it because they gave up their life for something they believed in. And maybe 4,000 in a war may not seem like much. It's nothing to be honest, but it's still 4,000 people and 4,000 families. So I don't want to come out as someone who completely says that you're complaining about the war in Afghanistan. You only lost 4,000 people. I'm not. I'm just an observation.
Iraqi government was deemed stable enough to allow the US to withdraw in 2011. The Arab Spring 2010. Starting in 2010, a series of pro-democracy rallies and protests spread across the Arab world, which led to the toppling of regimes in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and Yemen. The protests, which began peacefully in Syria, were violently put down, and in response, the protesters took up arms. The country became embroiled in a civil war. Meanwhile, the circumstances in neighboring Iraq allowed for the rise of Islamic State, and the group became notorious for their brutality, taking hostages and recording beheadings, carrying out massacres and
Oh
suicide
yeah,
bombings.
I don't know if you've seen those. I've only heard about them, but there were beheadings on YouTube, which is like what? How can you like what?
Spotting an opportunity, Islamic State spread to Syria, and their mission was to establish a worldwide caliphate, i.e., a single Islamic government ruling over all Muslims. The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, continued to grow, and in 2014, America once again stepped in and their so called caliphate was destroyed. Other international powers also became involved in the fight for Syria. Iran and Russia supported the Shia government, while Saudi Arabia, most other Gulf
So Syria, remember this is Shia,
states,
so
and
they're with Iran.
America initially supported the rebels. But as more and more violent fundamentalist groups joined the rebels, it became harder for those countries to continue supporting them. Russia has been instrumental in the Syrian regime hanging on to power, providing military support, and with this, they have signaled that they should once again be considered a global power. Yemen is
Yeah.
also another tragedy to emerge from the fallout of the Arab Spring. Iranian-backed Shia rebels, the Houthis, took hold of the north of the country, whereas the Saudi-backed government struggled to regain control. Seeing an opportunity, Al-Qaeda and Islamic State affiliates took control of the south of the country. In 2015, Saudi Arabia, fearing Iran's influence on their borders, launched a military intervention to restore the Yemeni
Oh,
government.
okay. So I was wondering why did they even attack Yemen? Didn't make any sense. That makes sense.
Chaos ensued, and the country's infrastructure has been destroyed. Conclusion. This video is for those looking for a high-level overview of what is happening in the Middle East and how it came to be this way. This is a broad brushstrokes explanation for the average person who is utterly confused by what is happening in the Middle East. This video is not about taking sides with Middle Eastern regimes or condemning the US and assuming they purposefully move to destabilize the region. This video is also not intended to attack Israel, surrounded by hostile countries, and it does not ignore the fact that the Jewish people have been subjected to anti Semitism throughout history. At the same time, this video is not unsympathetic to Palestinians who have effectively had their land taken away. Governments respond to domestic pressures and will act in their own national interests. People in power will have their own agendas, be it an inherited sense of entitlement or a misguided attempt at nation building. The real tragedy in the Middle East is the number of innocent civilians, Israelis, Palestinians,
How many?
Iraqis, Yemenis, Syrians, etc., all of whom have had their lives disrupted or even taken away as a result of
There's no
competing
number.
agendas and ideologies. If you would like to learn more about the various issues in the Middle East, a list of resources.
Okay, guys, this was an amazing video. Thank you for listening, for watching. This is Middle East Geopolitics Explained Simply by London City Girl. Go watch her. I mean, it was an incredibly well-made video. I learned a lot about it. Um, I knew the overall with the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Sunni and the Shia. I knew that, but I didn't know about the Iranian-Iraq war between 1980 and 1988. So I learned a lot. I didn't know that the reason why Saudi Arabia invaded Yemen was because of Shia influence uh, from Iran. I don't know if she confirmed it or maybe they just thought that Iran was supporting Shia-backed Al Qaeda or Shia-backed the Houthis. They were the Shia, I think. Anywho, this was an amazing video. I hope you learned as much as I did, and I'll see you guys next time.